as someone who is clearly from an entirely different area of knowledge as most of the presentations we've had, even the humanities ones, I must begin with a confession. You see, when you walk into a humanities conference, you usually find a little desk and an academic sitting behind it who is reading out an entire essay for some bizarre reason. And this morning I assumed that was what I was going to be doing, and then I saw all of the science presentations, so I ripped off my essay and made these little nifty note cards, so bear with me. So teaching in verse in the 14th century. So I'm going to take you back to 1213. When Pope Innocent III decided that it was necessary to bring every single ecclesiastical leader in Europe together. So by 1215, because people were really slow back then, 2 years after this, over 1,000 ecclesiastical leaders joined together in Rome and debated a number of things, such as how transubstantiation works, meaning the Eucharist. They decided to organize a fifth crusade, and they did all sorts of things there. They were there for a couple of months, living off of what the peasants were making or whatever was happening in the 13th century. So one of the most important canons that happened in this council, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, is that they decided in Canon 21 that every single individual, man or woman, once they reach the age of discretion, should have to confess his or her sins to a priest. So obviously this was extremely revolutionary in the Middle Ages, and it's something that we can still see now. It was like a way in which the single individual was starting to become connected to the institutional church, and was really forcing priests to listen to what the people had to say, and really caring about what the individual was going through. That being said, while most people focus on the first half of Canon 21, the idea that confession should happen once a year, people don't usually look at the second part of Canon 21 of the Fourth Lateran Council, which says, "Wherefore let the salutary decree be published frequently in the churches, that no one may find in the plea of ignorance a shadow of excuse." This makes total sense to us. Like right now, even if I'm ignorant of a law, if I break this law, I will still go to prison, I will still be prosecuted for it. But in reality, this was extremely revolutionary in the Middle Ages, because it's part of a greater problem that was happening throughout the church and throughout Europe in general. Innocent III basically thought, everyone is really dumb right now. So what Innocent III was thinking was that, first of all, people did not know theology well enough to be able to confess their sins properly. And secondly, the priests were not well educated enough in order to be able to lead people to confess properly. So this was a huge problem for the church. In one of his sermons during the Ecumenical Council, Pope Innocent III even said that ex ignorantia provenit delictum atque peccatum. From ignorance come sin and misdoing. So clearly ignorance was a huge thing that these people needed to tackle. That being said, and because we're obviously dealing with the 13th century, this took a long time to have any effect, especially in England, because it was really far away from Italy. So, all the way to 1281, 60 years after this happened, the British people go, oh, we should totally do something about it. So they started enacting all of these legislations in the late 13th century when they're like, guys, we really need to make sure that people know what they're doing and people know the basic articles of the faith. So in 1281, Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, says, it's very important for every single clergyman in England to instruct at least 4 times a year their entire congregation on the articles of the faith, the 10 Commandments, the works of mercy, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 virtues, and the sacraments. This was the minimum theological knowledge that every single Christian in Europe was supposed to have. So if any of you are Christians and don't know all of these by heart, John Peckham would not be happy. So the problem was that in England, they started publishing all of these various documents in which they outlined all of these things so that people would be able to understand it, so that people would be able to know these aspects. However, these were, first of all, mostly in Latin, and secondly, extremely boring. It was basically a list of all of this theological material, and then, whatever theological writer was writing this telling you that you would go to sin if you didn't memorize everything. So this was extremely problematic, because the bishops and the people writing these materials realized that no one was actually reading them. No one was actually learning the things that were supposed to be being learned. So the problem with this, so the way that this was solved was that from 1281 until the 15th century, we start getting a different corpus of theological manuals. And this new corpus of theological manuals becomes a new literary genre in England. And it's been categorized in the very catchy term by this really important scholar into encyclopedic religious poems in Middle English written between 1285 and 1409. So very, very catchy term. That being said, this like really long name that this scholar gave us basically describes what these manuals are like. They're encyclopedic, so they're very long, which means that my back is really muscular after carrying these manuals around all the time. Secondly, they're religious. They basically explore all of the tenets that John Peckham outlined in his constitutions. And third of all, they're in Middle English. They're in the vernacular as opposed to Latin, and therefore they could be accessible to a greater number of English people. So these texts are extremely understudied in my field, and when people talk about these texts, they usually just emphasize that they are in English as opposed to in Latin. So obviously the idea that they're in English is very important because it's the democratization of religious knowledge, as well as the creation of an English national identity through language. The idea that every single individual in England should be able to read these aspects of the faith, and therefore all belong together to a Church of England, as we would later see many, many centuries later. But a lot of people have focused on this, but let us not forget that these manuals are not just in English, but they're all also in verse. And people haven't really been looking about what is the difference between prose and poetry. Why exactly are we teaching people in poetry, in verse, and in meter? And in 1990, this highly influential, brilliant scholar, Mary Carruthers, published this book called The Book of Memory. I see Kate nodding. And what she said was, she's an absolutely brilliant scholar, don't get me wrong, but what she said is that the Middle Ages really prioritized memorization. So for instance, she notes how in medieval manuscripts, you often get like these little textual details that would help people memorize things, or like find their place in the manuscript. She calls them like mnemonic cues in order to find their place. However, people have seriously misapplied her arguments and essentially go on and say like, oh, everyone in the 14th century was memorizing everything, and that is the reason why we have things written in verse, because verse is easier to memorize than prose. Well, that is true to an extent. For instance, I'm pretty sure every single person in this room knows at least one TV commercial jingle by heart. The rationale behind it is that things that are in verse, such as songs, are very easy to memorize. That is the reason why, for instance, we teach kids the alphabet song, because it's easier to memorize than if we just like list A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or the reason why I still need the alphabet song to alphabetize something. But if we look at these texts, I find it just completely unbelievable that people would be memorizing these manuals. Like one of the main texts that I'm going to be talking about is 30,000 lines long. It's literally been edited into 3 thick volumes that basically no one is reading right now. I find it really hard to think that any person, whether today or in the Middle Ages, was actually memorizing 30,000 lines in verse. So I think there's another reason why this is happening. So there is a problem with verse in the Middle Ages, and we can see this in these 3 quotes. So just to give a little bit of context, the first 2 are what we call literary commentaries, which is before we had like academic writers writing about literature, we had what were called the Latin commentaries on text. So people like William of Conches in 12th century France and Alexander Neckham in 13th century England would often write marginalia to these texts, or would often write prefaces to texts that they would read, usually classical texts. An example of this is William of Conches' commentary on the Consolation of Philosophy. The Consolation of Philosophy is a 6th century text written by this guy Boethius. So Boethius essentially gets imprisoned because of treason. And then while he's in prison, he writes this text in which he's really sad because they're about to execute him. So in a dream vision, he imagines the allegorical figure of Lady Philosophy coming onto him and being like, yo, you need to chill, like everything happens for a reason. So he basically is consoled by philosophy. So in the Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most important aspects of it is that it happens in both prose and verse. And each of the passages in prose and verse serve different functions within the narrative. Lady Philosophy is trying to console Boethius in both of these modes. But when people like William of Conches are describing how this text is working, he says things like, in prose, therefore, Boethius uses reason for consolation. In meter, he interposes the light to remove sorrow. So prose becomes logical or argumentative language, the one you would expect from didactic literature, for instance, whereas prose is the sort of thing that we read for pleasure. In the same way, Alexander Neckham, commentating on the marriage of philology and Mercury, which is another text that is also in prosimetrum, meaning half in prose and half in meter, he says that we find usefulness in prose and delight in meter. And all of these people are coming from a tradition, coming all the way from Plato and Cicero, in which Cicero tells us in the Tusculan Disputations that poems influence the strongest of men. They soften our minds. So poems are usually feminized and become this thing which is basically just either giving you pleasure or like getting rid of your manly vigor or whatnot. So poetry is not the obvious choice to write didactic literature in the Middle Ages. So why are people doing this? And in order to answer this question is that I turn to the cursor of, no sorry, I still have another one before this. So all the way down to the late 14th century, we have Chaucer writing the Canterbury Tales. For those of you who have not read the greatest work of English literature of all time, the Canterbury Tales are a series of pilgrims walking to Canterbury to see a relic. And on the way they decided that in order to pass time, they will all tell tales. Most of these are really bawdy, and most of these are in poetry. However, before the last poem, this guy, the parson, who is like this really serious guy, basically says that he does not agree with rhyme. Rime holde ibut little betre. He says that he is unwilling to tell his tale in rhyme, and chooses instead to tell a myria tale in prosa, a merry tale in prose. What continues from this is not a tale whatsoever, it's not a work of fiction, but rather a catechetical manual such as the ones that Archbishop Peckham was introducing. What the parson is actually telling is it's like really technical manual about what to do about the 7 deadly sins. So clearly he is deciding that prose is the obvious didactic means in order for having didactic literature, whereas poetry should be used for like the really bawdy tales that came before him. So why are these texts about 50 years before the Parson's Tale talking in verse? And so I turn to the Cursor Mundi. The Cursor Mundi is a text that essentially tells the entire history of the world. And the reason why it tells the entire history of the world is because you needed to know that in order to be a good Christian. But the text, however, does not begin with, say, let there be light in Genesis, but rather begins by saying, man yernes rimes fortuhere, and romans red on manere sere. So what the Cursor Mundi author, whose name we don't know, is saying, is that a lot of people like to hear rhymes. A lot of people like to read things such as the tales of William the Conqueror or King Arthur. These are the things that people are reading. And the reason why this is problematic is because tu rede angere il conis prest. Everybody is just reading whatever they find more pleasurable, which is problematic because the wisman will wisdom here. Wise people will listen to wisdom, meaning religious literature, but the fool him dragus to folinere. But sometimes when they read folly, when they read things such as Romans narratives or King Arthur, they become sinfulness. Folly is not like folly in modern English, it's literally like a really bad kind of sinfulness that we want to escape from. So what I see this poet doing is that he is essentially taking on the language of romance in order to tell his religious story, attempting to recreate what Roman stories are doing, but transforming them, reappropriating them into something that can be didactic. So in this quotation that you can read on your own because I'm running out of time, what the poet is doing is saying that people love paramours. Paramours are, in Romans tales, essentially like the beloved, the person that, like, the damsel in distress that you're trying to woo. What he does in the next few lines is saying that people should be writing rhymes about a different paramour. This paramour is the Virgin Mary. So essentially, he uses language for like damsels in distress from Romans rhymes and turns it into something religious, turns it into something salvific, attempting to use the things that people are already reading in order to get them to read this. And if you look at the actual way in which this is being written, it's in octosyllabic couplets, meaning that these two rhyme, and it's 8 syllables. Afterwards, this became a really serious meter. But in the early 14th century, in the French being written in England, this was the meter of Romance. So we essentially see something that for any reader will look like a Romance, but it's actually teaching them the basic tenets of the Christian faith. Thank you.
Is there any questions? How do you come across it? Because it's quite a... Where you at?
How did I come across this? So There's a book that my undergrad supervisor wrote, which was on Boethius and how prose and poetry work in that work. And then I started thinking, but what happens in texts that are not prose and poetry, but rather, can I think about something that, like today we will never see a manual for anything being written in poetry. Can I think of something that was written in the Middle Ages that I would not think would obviously be in poetry that is in poetry, and can I apply these theories of poetry and prose to these texts?
So a lot of sort of contemporary work, there is always a sort of parallel commentary about it, usually criticising it, that it sort of demeans the work. You sort of see that a lot in sort of modern day sort of literature and things. Was there a similar commentary you're carrying?
No, absolutely. So the poet himself, that's my next slide that I didn't get to. The poet himself is making the same critique, because when it gets to the point in which he has to tell the story of the Passion, meaning like the pinnacle of the Christian faith, he says, and now I have to change my meter, and changes it into the meter of Latin hymn. And so therefore even he is acknowledging that, like, yes, this has captured the people's attention, but I can't really tell the crucifixion using this language. And so he switches to a more formal meter, which paradoxically then became the meter of romance in the 15th century.
It's quite interesting that they'll quite explicitly use both.
Yeah.
How important is it for you yourself to be able to read the Middle English? Because I guess the meter no longer works if you translate it, right?
Oh yeah.
Can you just read that or that fine?
God. Fortibliskeandat paramur quen I have net medosokur.
What I mean is, like, can you understand that? Like, no problem. Okay. And have you been able to do it? Did you always find that quite easy?
No, I had to trade for it.
Because it's like, I guess it's quite a subtle kind of thing.
Yeah.
I guess kind of you lose.
It's also this is also a northern text. Texts from London are closer to modern English because that's the one that survived essentially, because they were the capital. This is a northern text, and therefore it's a little bit farther away from modern English. Kate?
So I would imagine that this was perceived as a somewhat more complicated form. Is there ever a sense that makes it less accessible to sort of a semi-literate reader?
Well, there is a huge body of work which argues that so octosyllabic couplets are easy to write, essentially. They are easy to write in English and they're easy to write in French. And then this, the way that people usually talk about it is that they think that the cursor was being performed rather than being read. So it was being performed so that people would understand, like, the stuff behind it. But I think that is a valuable way to think about it, but my question is, like, taking away the idea of performance, like, why exactly octosyllabic couplets or something that ought to be performed or something that people would find accessible? Yeah.
The way those rhymes are like a pattern, like, do they use it as it comes to make sense? Or
So there's two ways of writing verse in medieval manuscripts. A lot of them actually just write it out in prose because parchment was extremely expensive and therefore they want to save space. So it's up to modern editors to figure out where the line breaks are going. And sometimes they will have like a little line indicating the line break. Some of them, especially as time progressed and especially as paper become more common than parchment, would actually write out a verse.
Great, thank you.